Welcome back. We start from Afghanistan, where nearly 100 Taliban fighters and Afghan army soldiers have been killed in the last 24 hours. Both sides claim to have caused heavy damage during fighting in 18 of the country's provinces. Taliban spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid says fighters mounted 45 attacks, wounding 39 Afghan security officials. The Afghan army says their forces carried 25 operations and 13 airstrikes against the Taliban. The army says 6 other Taliban fighters have been wounded in the attacks. Meanwhile, the Afghan government has finalized its list of delegates for a meeting with the Taliban in China to discuss the intra-Afghan peace process. On Monday, Afghan President Ashraf Ghani agreed to meet the Taliban in Beijing after talking with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Ghani's spokesperson Sadiq Siddiqui said this meeting could make way for a broader dialogue between the two sides. Siddiqui said the Afghan government will soon share its list of delegates with the Chinese government. The spokesperson said the meeting's date will be announced by Beijing soon. Meanwhile, the Taliban have yet to make any comment on peace talks with the Afghan government in China. The United States says all countries should increase pressure on Iran as it resumes uranium enrichment at one of its nuclear facilities. In a statement, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says Iran is positioning itself to have the option of a rapid nuclear breakout. He said all countries must reject Iran's nuclear extortion and take serious steps to increase pressure on it. Earlier, Iran cancelled the accreditation of a UN nuclear inspector over its suspicions of foul play. Tehran's Atomic Energy Organization said the inspector set off an entry checkpoint alarm at the Natanz plant last week. Under 2015's landmark JCPOA deal, Iran's nuclear plants are continuously monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency. In Yemen, 6 people, including 4 civilians, have been killed in an attack on a military base in the coastal town of Mocha. Medics say 26 others were wounded in the attack, which also damaged a hospital run by Doctors Without Borders. A Yemeni military official said Hutu rebels launched 4 ballistic missiles and drones towards a military position in Mocha, but the rebels have made no claim of responsibility. The attack comes after weeks of relative calm in Yemen and the signing of a peace deal between the government and southern separatists. Pakistan says India has turned down concessions announced by Islamabad for Sikh pilgrims on the eve of the inauguration of the Kartarpur corridor. Foreign Office spokesman Mohammad Faisal says India has disregarded the Sikh community's sentiments by turning down the offer. Pakistan has waived the visa fee and the requirement to carry passports for the pilgrims. Addressing a press briefing earlier, Faisal said over 10,000 Sikhs from all around the world will attend the inauguration ceremony of the corridor. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan will inaugurate the visa-free corridor on Saturday. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has asked global community to play its role in immediate lifting of siege in Indian-occupied Kashmir. PM Khan made this call in a meeting with President of Council of States of Swiss Federation Jean-René Fournier in Islamabad. In the meeting, PM Khan told René about the worsening humanitarian crisis in the valley and its grave impact on regional security. The Pakistani Prime Minister said India's illegal actions in violation of international law and UNSC resolutions are jeopardizing regional peace. René has earlier condemned blatant human rights violations in occupied Kashmir, calling for a peaceful resolution of the issue. New Delhi's curfew and communications blackout in the valley has now entered 95th day. The New York Times has once again highlighted the plight of women in Indian-occupied Kashmir under curfew. The leading U.S. newspaper published a report sharing the misery of women journalists, mothers, daughters, and sisters in the besieged valley. It said female photojournalist was harassed by Indian forces as they threatened to assault and torture her for covering protests. Journalist Masrat Zahra refused to stay silent, saying she is one of the few voices coming out of the valley, otherwise gagged by India. The report says Indian occupying forces kidnap females and shift them to unknown jails, where their families fearing the worst. The report said women can't leave their homes because of the fear of being abducted and harassed by Indian soldiers. At least 4 people were killed and 35 others wounded when Iraq security forces used live rounds to disperse protesters gathered on a bridge in central Baghdad. Baghdad has been hit by the biggest wave of anti-government demonstrations in decades.
Thousands are taking part in anti-government demonstrations in the capital and southern provinces. Protesters blocked Ahrar, Shuhada, and Bab al-Muaddam bridges to bring the country to a standstill. They also blocked the entrance to the Nasiriyah oil refinery in southern Iraq, prompting a fuel shortage. A government official says the oil refinery blockade has cost the country over $6 billion. Meanwhile, the U.S. has condemned the killing and kidnapping of unarmed demonstrators.
The International Criminal Court has sentenced the former Congolese rebel leader Bosco Ntaganda, also known as the Terminator, to 30 years in prison. Ntaganda was convicted earlier this year of war crimes including murder, rape and slavery. The sentence is the highest ever penalty handed down by the ICC. He committed these crimes as military operations chief at the Union of Congolese Patriots militia in the eastern DRC from 2002 to 2003. Ntaganda voluntarily surrendered to the UN in 2013 and asked to be sent to the court in Netherlands for trial. 37 people have been killed and 60 wounded in an attack on a Canadian mining company convoy in eastern Burkina Faso. The convoy was ambushed 40 kilometers from the company's Bongo mine. The company Semafo says the military convoy escort vehicle was struck by an explosive device before gunmen opened fire. The gold mining business beefed up security last year when 2 of its mines in the country came under attack. The West African state has been racked by an insurgency that has killed hundreds of people in recent years. At the same time, the military has struggled to contain violence spilling over the border from neighboring Mali. For more on this, we are joined by our correspondent Phil Ilhaza from Abuja. Thank you, Phil, for joining us. Why are we seeing more attacks by militants in West African countries?
Well, thank you. What we know is that from the recent years, I mean, in the recent decade, we've seen Islamic State militants try to gain access and control over some African countries. For example, in Nigeria, where in 2015, the Islamic State actually formed a faction of a decade-long insurgency group known as Boko Haram. They formed a faction of Boko Haram now known as ISWAP, Islamic State of West Africa Province. And since 2015, we've seen more sophisticated attacks focused on military formations, high-profile kidnapping of high-profile civilians being kidnapped, and all that. So it's more like a conscious effort by these insurgent groups to try to control swaths of territories in Africa. And also, it's not far-fetched from the fact that there's been some form of control or seriousness in tackling insurgency in other parts of the world, apart from the Sahel and this part of Africa. So it's more like while the terrorist organizations and the attacks are being killed in those parts of the world, in the Middle East, we are now beginning to see countries in Africa bear the brunt of the fact that porous borders, loopholes in insecurity infrastructure, and ideology challenges in this part of the world. It now seems like the insurgents are feasting on these to try to control more swaths of territory in Africa.
Some militant groups were allies of ISIS. Will the death of ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi have an impact on the groups operating in this area?
Well, it's unclear how exactly the death of the militant leader al-Baghdadi will take its toll on the structure. But speaking to some security experts, and they have suggested or said that taking out the leader, yes, it might have a temporal effect on the group. But we know that just recently that position has been replaced by someone else. Not much is known so far about the leader, the new leader. leader, but we know that the Islamic State militants now have a new leader. What we also know is that experts are saying rather than just take out or focus on the leader, also try to attempt to break down their strong structures, break down their rank and files in not just their headquarters, maybe in Syria and Libya and the likes, but in other African countries where they have not yet gained full grounds, or control of swaths of territories. And maybe that's the reason why African leaders will now need to come together to coordinate their approach in tackling insurgency in this part of the world.
Yesterday, 37 people were killed in an ambush on a convoy transporting employees of a Canadian mining company in Burkina Faso. Is there any possibility of any joint military coordination among Western African nations against the militant outfits?
Well, we know that there's been a G5 Sahel force that has been in existence for almost a decade now. They're backed up strongly by French forces, and they've helped, for example, countries like Mali regain an entire northern hemisphere that was in 2012 taken over by these same insurgents. But we've seen in recent times more attacks, series of attacks in Mali, in Nigeria, in Niger, in Chad, and a couple of these countries in the Sahel region. And just like the president of Mali said, that now more than ever, more assistance, involvement of Western world will now be needed to be able to tackle this insurgency. We also know that ECOWAS, which is a combination of countries in the West African region, have met recently, and they've condemned the attacks, and they've also gone ahead to pledge about $1 billion to tackle the insecurity challenges, especially as it regards to insurgency. We also know that the French defense minister says there will be some form of reinforcement of special forces from not just France but European countries this time to try to help Malian army to tackle the insurgency there, and that is something that we believe that the ECOWAS and other African leaders will try to see how they can gain assistance from other Western countries in order to tackle what is going on. But so far we are not clear about what force is tackling insurgency when it comes to the Sahel region, apart from the G5 forces, multinational joint task force with some of these West African countries. These are the ones that are tackling it so far as we speak.
Thank you, Phil. We were talking to our correspondent from Abuja, Phil Ilhaza. In the United States, Muslim Democrats Ghazala Hashmi and Abrar Umesh have made history in Virginia's elections. In a surprise victory, Hashmi unseated incumbent Republican Glenn Sturtevant in the state Senate. Meanwhile, Umesh became the youngest woman to hold elected office in Virginia's history. Umesh is also the first Muslim woman to be elected in the state. Tweeting after her victory, Hashmi said the results show the status quo is no longer accepted. Two Muslim male Democrats, Ibrahim Samira and Sam Rasool, already serve in Virginia's General Assembly. The election has been described as a possible watershed moment for the once conservative southern state. The U.S. House of Representatives Intelligence Committee will open public hearings in its impeachment inquiry into President Donald Trump next week. The House is investigating whether Trump abused the powers of his office by pressurizing Ukraine for personal political gain.
The top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, William Taylor, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, George Kent, will testify on November 13, while former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, will appear on November 15.
Those open hearings will be an opportunity for the American people to evaluate the witnesses for themselves, to make their own determinations about the credibility of the witnesses, but also to learn firsthand about the facts of the president's misconduct.
If the House votes to approve the articles of impeachment, the Republican-controlled Senate would then hold a trial on whether to remove Trump from office.
U.S. President Donald Trump and his Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan will meet in Washington on November 13th. The two leaders decided to meet after discussing the latest situation in northeastern Syria on the phone. Trump said Erdogan told him Turkey has captured ISIS terrorists, including the wife and sister of al-Baghdadi. The U.S. president said among other topics, they discussed ways to end hostilities with the Kurds. Meanwhile, Erdogan said both leaders spoke of bilateral trade goals and the fight against terrorism. The meeting comes amid strong pressure by US, Republican and Democratic senators on Trump to levy more sanctions on Ankara. More stories after a short break. Stay with us. Thirteen people have died in a road accident in Pakistan's southern Sindh province. The police say 5 others were injured in the accident. They say a passenger bus collided head-on with a rickshaw on the national highway in the Mottiari district. Officials say one carriageway of the national highway has been closed after the accident. They say the bus passengers were traveling from Nawabshah to Karachi. A 20-year-old student has been killed and 20 people wounded in ongoing clashes in Bolivia. The fatality brings total death toll to 3. The tragedy struck in the central city of Cochabamba, where pro- and anti-regime activists skirmished. The town hall was also burned down in Morales' stronghold of Winto. Morales says the student was an innocent victim of hateful political groups promoting racial violence. Meanwhile, conservative opposition leader Luis Fernando Camacho has also called for Morales to resign. The 40-year-old politician has also called on the military to intervene. Morales has urged the military to serve the people and has so far remained neutral. German airline Lufthansa says it will slash 700 to 800 jobs at its Austrian Airlines subsidiary. The move is part of a plan to cut costs in the face of growing competition. Lufthansa's chief Carsten Spohr said the job cut would help the group achieve savings of $100 million per year by 2021. In a separate statement, Austrian Airlines said the job cuts would take place over the next 2 years. Earlier, the airline's flight attendants union called a strike over pay and pensions. The UFO union said the strike would hit the Lufthansa flights from German airports. 2 Australian climbers have died after falling 300 meters from a mountain in New Zealand's Remarkables Range. Rescuers say a rope connecting the pair was severed on sharp rocks, causing the fall. Brett Lanfer and James Paley were on a guided ascent of the mountain near the southern tourist town of Queenstown. Police say the men's guide avoided the fall.
11:45 a.m. yesterday, an emergency call was made by the guide alerting emergency services to an incident on the mountain where James and Brett have fallen from a significant altitude down the east face of a double cone. The guide was not involved in the fall.
In New Zealand, lawmakers have passed a zero-carbon bill to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to a near-neutral level by 2050. The new legislation mandates that New Zealand should produce no greenhouse gases except methane in 40 years' time. Spearheaded by the Labour-led coalition government, the bill was passed with cross-party support from the main opposition National Party. The bill accords different treatment to methane emissions from animals compared to other greenhouse gases. After the passage of the bill, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said New Zealand is on the right side of the history.
I absolutely believe and continue to stand by the statement that climate change is the biggest challenge of our time. And for us here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that means for this generation, this is our nuclear moment.
Studying climate change and sustainability will be compulsory for Italian school students from next year. Education Minister Lorenzo Fioramonti says Rome wants to lead the way in environmental education. Fioramonti said all public schools will include over 30 hours a year in their curricula to study climate-linked issues. The ministry also announced a panel of scientific experts to help it revamp the national curriculum. Fioramonti belongs to the 5-Star Movement, which was a history of environmental concern and grassroots activism. Right-wing opposition parties have criticized him for his stance on climate change and taxation on plastic. In America, an environmentalist has been living a simple life in Florida wanting to inspire people to make their lives healthier. For the past year, he has restricted himself to the food, medication, and other primary goods he grew or foraged from nature. More in this report.
The 33-year-old Rob Greenfield feasts on a bowl of papaya, coriander, and green moringa leaves he grew in his garden. He has transformed his tiny home into an urban farm where papayas, bananas, eggplant, and peppers all thrive. Greenfield put together an open-air kitchen of sorts where he keeps the honey produced from honeycombs.
So for the last year, I've been growing and foraging 100% of my food. No grocery stores, no restaurants, no beer at a bar. All of my food has either come from my garden or that I've foraged from nature.
He has built a toilet al fresco and uses leaves for toilet paper, minimizing all the production of trash.
And I currently grow my own toilet paper, and this is softer than anything you can buy at the store.
Greenfield launched his sustainable lifestyle in Orlando, a metropolitan area home to about 2.5 million people.
I want to inspire them to question their food and then to change their diets, to start to grow their own food, to support local farmers, and eat in a way that's better for the earth, our communities, and ourselves.
Not too many, but Rob has at least inspired some of his neighbors who say they want to adopt his simple living.
So this is rainwater, and that's what I drink when I'm in Orlando.
Making violins is a centuries-old art that combines the sound, feel, and look in one instrument. In North Macedonia, a self-taught violin maker has been handcrafting some exceptional pieces, winning international fame in the process. The former painter says he never expected to find himself creating violins and violas. This report tells how he got here.
Years back, Svetozar Bogdanovsky could not afford to buy a violins for his son, who was an aspiring musician. So he began making them. Years later, his son is a professional musician, and Bogdanovsky's creations are famous around the world. He says he owes his success to the ideal mixture of painter and musician.
Painting was my main profession, and I had not been considering any other direction. The need to build violins arose when my son, then 8 years old, showed great talent as a violinist.
The violins are made from maple and acoustic spruce, the best for making violins in the Balkans, Bosnia in particular. The bows are also specially prepared with essential oils and resins. The artist has so far sold more than 700 violins throughout the world, some costing tens of thousands of dollars.
Each violin has something specific and unique. That's why no two are the same, even though each instrument looks just like any other. They differ from each other just as people do.
Their masterpieces, violins, are played by both students and professional musicians. The prestigious Violin Society of America awarded Bogdanovsky the Certificate of Merit for Tone at their annual awards in 2012.
We'll be right back after a short break. Stay with us. The United States and China have agreed to phase out tariffs imposed on each other's goods during their months-long trade war.
China's Commerce Ministry says Beijing and Washington should simultaneously end all tariffs if a Phase 1 trade deal is reached. The ministry's spokesperson added the tariff cancellation is an important condition for any agreement. He said the trade war began with tariffs and should end with the cancellation of tariffs.
For the past 2 weeks, leaders from both sides had serious and constructive discussions on the proper resolution of each other's core concerns. According to the agreement's process, they agreed to cancel tariffs in phases.
US President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping may sign a deal this month to end the dispute. Meanwhile, China's state media says Beijing is also considering removing restrictions on poultry imports from the US.
The first Chinese freight train from Xi'an to Europe has reached Turkey after crossing Istanbul's undersea Bosphorus rail tunnel. The train arrived in Ankara, where Turkish and Chinese officials were there to welcome it. Turkey's Transport Minister Mehmet Kahir Turhan called it a historic moment and a new era in railway transport. He praised China's Belt and Road Initiative project using the railway to link Europe, China, Asia and the Middle East. He said the line has reduced the journey time between China and Turkey from a month to 12 days. Now let's look at the weather from around the globe. This is all for now. For latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news.